Good evening, everybody, and welcome to this evening's lecture hosted by the University of Bath Institute for Policy Research. My name is Nick Pearce. I'm Professor of Public Policy at the University of Bath. I direct the Institute. I'm hosting this evening's lecture, and I'm delighted to say that we're joined by Ed Humferson for this evening's lecture. Ed is Director General for Regulation and Head of the Office of Statistics Regulation, the OSR, which is the public body that provides independent regulation of all official statistics in the UK. And its key aim is to enhance public confidence in the trustworthiness, quality and the value of the statistics that are produced by government. Ed is going to speak to us tonight to discuss in particular, and certainly use as an entry point to a wider debate, the exam results last year, the so-called exam results fiasco, and to address some of the lessons that we can learn from the awarding of exam grades in 2020. As people will know, there was considerable public disquiet about the awarding of grades and what appeared to be at least the use of algorithms and statistical modelling in public policy, which had a very direct and real impact on thousands, hundreds of thousands of young people and their families across the country. And in the months that followed the awarding of the grades last year, OSR undertook a review of the lessons learned from the approach to developing the models that then decided the exam results. And using exam grades as a test, it sought to understand, in the world of abundant data in which we now live, what can we learn about the real life consequences of using algorithms or not? What do we understand to have been going on here? So in his lecture, Ed will discuss the review's findings, he'll discuss what we can learn from them, but also set out some wider lessons for how we think about statistics and statistical modeling and algorithms in public policy and public life in the future. So a really interesting subject for discussion this evening. We'll have a lot of opportunity for debate and discussion when Ed's given his presentation. I'll chair the event. If you've got questions, put them in the chat function, in the Q&A, and then I'll group them together and put them to Ed. And just a couple of points of housekeeping before we start. Firstly, note that your camera and microphones will be switched off. If you have got a question, as I say, do put it into the Q&A function. And secondly, we're also recording this session, so filming and photography is taking place. And what that means also is that we will be able to show this lecture in the future as a podcast and video downloadable from our website. So if you need to catch up with it again, want to go back over it, you'll be able to do so. So with that housekeeping set out, I'll thank you all again for joining us, and I'll pass over to you, Ed.
Thank you very much, Nick, for that introduction, and good evening, everyone, and thanks for taking the time to join me. As Nick says, I'm going to cover the exam story, but I'm going to use it as a jumping off point into a much broader range of issues, which I have found myself in my work as a regulator of statistics thinking a lot about. Now, just while I'm calling up my slides, I would say that anybody who works with me, any of my colleagues, will tell you that one thing that is completely banned where I work at the Office for Statistics Regulation is what we know as the J word. And the J word is the word that you find in the following sentence, very common in kind of business and policy speak. We're on a bit of a J with this. Or this is a bit of a J. And for those of you wondering what it is, the J is for journey, and it's a complete cliche, and I really try and avoid it at all costs, which is a pity, because this presentation is, in a way, it's a little bit a story of how we have, in our role as regulators, come to go through a process of learning about a data abundant world and algorithms and so on. So I'm going to try and avoid the J word, but if I do slip it in at one or 2 points, please do not tell all the colleagues that I work with that I used it, because they'll never let me live it down. So I want to begin our, let's call it our trip with this, this image. It shows some protests which took place last summer in the wake of the process of awarding exams, specifically A-level grades, using what was described as an algorithm. There are lots of protests, and as you can see in this photograph behind the person who's holding up this placard, there are lots of other placards, but this one particularly caught our eye. Your algorithm doesn't know me. I think it succinctly summarizes not just that story about exams, but a much wider anxiety in our society, that in a world of abundant data, somehow, despite all the kind of seductive promise of personalization, of algorithms that can guide us in our choices of travel and our choice of books, that can decide what kind of products and services are advertised to us, that can indeed decide what grades we might need, but also can decide just by looking at our image on our face whether we're happy or sad. Somehow this "your algorithm doesn't know me" captures a very kind of broad-based anxiety. And I want to make that kind of a theme of my talk. So why is this relevant to me at all? Well, let me begin with some basics about my role. I'm the head, as Nick has said, of the Office for Statistics Regulation, and we are the regulatory arm of the UK Statistics Authority. And our role, our statutory role, is to promote and safeguard the production and publication of statistics that serve the public good. We don't produce any statistics. We're not a producer of statistics. That's done by ONS, the Office for National Statistics, and by many, many government departments: Department for Education, Department for Health and Social Care, Public Health England, the Scottish Government, the Welsh Government, the Administration of Northern Ireland. All of those bodies, public bodies, they produce statistics, and it's my job, our job, to ensure that those statistics that they publish are meaningful and reliable for the public, that they serve the public good. Now, we do that in three main ways. We look at how statistics are produced. We uphold trustworthiness, quality, and value. And that's a kind of our core work. It's assessment, it's a review. It's the sort of thing you'd expect a regulatory function to do. We go and look at an individual set of statistics like GDP or inflation, and we publish an assessment of it. In the grey box at the bottom, we do something much more visible publicly, which is we look at how statistics are used in public debate. We protect the role of statistics in public discourse. That's very public and very visible and very important. And the third thing we do is we develop a better understanding of this notion of the public good, how statistics are valued by society, how they are valuable, and how people make use of them. All of this is underpinned by a code of practice. And this is so central to all of our work, and indeed it was central to our review of exams. I just want to spend a couple of minutes on it. It's a code of practice for the publication of statistics by government departments, that any government department must comply with this code, and it's got three pillars: a pillar of trustworthiness, of quality, and of value. Trustworthiness is about the people and the organizations that produce statistics. It's based on the insights of Honora O'Neill, the great philosopher, who pointed out that organizations shouldn't demand or seek trust. That's a fruitless goal. What they should do is provide evidence that they are trustworthy, and the evidence that they are trustworthy resides in the processes, the people, the professionalism that they can demonstrate. And that's what processes are for. It's to show that the judgments that lead to the statistics follow best professional guidance and are not simply hooked up to serve the political needs of the government of the day. So that's trustworthiness. Quality starts from the very important insight that any statistical output is an estimate. It's not, in a sense, a definitive version of the truth. It's an estimate. And the job of the producer is to show that their estimate is the best available estimate. That involves being very clear about the data source, where the data are from, about the methods, and about the strengths and limitations. We call that assured quality. That's really about being honest about how the estimate could be misleading. And then really importantly, the third pillar is value. So you could have something which is a product of a very trustworthy set of processes. It's high quality in the sense that it's the best available estimate, but it could be about something that people aren't very interested in. You could imagine a set of statistics about the government's use of paper clips, done in a trustworthy way, high quality, but not very valuable, because it doesn't really support the kinds of questions that people in society answer. So we always look for value. We look for relevance to users, accessibility, clarity and insight, innovation and efficiency. That's the code of practice for statistics that underpins everything that we do, and you'll see how these concepts flow through when I start to speak about some concrete examples, particularly the exams example. But actually, I want to start our travel somewhere else. When I really first became aware of the idea that statistics and data were, whilst important, but becoming detached from the interests of the public they were intended to serve. I've entitled this slide Beyond GDP, but what's really in my mind is this quote: "That's your bloody GDP." Now, I suspect that might be familiar to some of you and might be new to others. So that quote is from an anecdote told by a professor of economics from King's College London. He's called Professor Anand Menon. And during the EU referendum, he wrote about an experience he had when he was going out and doing public sort of engagement exercises in different parts of the UK and talking about the choice the British people were facing. And he tells the story that in Newcastle, he was laying out the for and against of leaving the European Union. And one thing he said was, look, if we leave the European Union, that might endanger the recovery in GDP that the country has seen over the last couple of years. And in 2016, this was in Newcastle, a woman in the audience responded, "That's your bloody GDP, not ours." And he wrote about this and how struck he'd been by that phrase. And it's become a sort of iconic phrase in the world of economic measurement, because it captures a sense of alienation, of how the people who think about macroeconomics talk in a way which feels very alienating to the public that it's supposed to be serving. It also captures a sense that GDP is not a very good measure of anything, certainly of economic welfare. And that sense that GDP doesn't measure the right things has got a lot of professional economic backing. There's been some excellent reports. Here's one from, it's called the Stiglitz-Fitoussi report, Beyond GDP, Measuring What Counts. The implication there is GDP doesn't measure what counts. And countless other reports. Here's one I particularly liked from the UCL Institute for Global Prosperity, again, talking about going beyond GDP. So that's your bloody GDP. 2016 was my first real encounter with this sense that the statistics that we capture and measure, or use of statistics to serve the public, was becoming detached from the interests and the concerns of that public itself. And I've given talks about that as your bloody GDP to economics audiences, and how people need to rethink how economics is communicated. That's not where I'm going to end this, this march. I'm going to move on to the main event, which is the exam story in 2020, which kind of moves us on from the alienation of shouting, "That's your bloody GDP," to marching in the street with placards against an algorithm. So the backstory is, and you'll all be familiar with this, but just to kind of set the story out, March 2020, because of the lockdown, the first lockdown, governments of the UK announced the cancellation of the summer exams, the GCSEs and the A-levels and some of the related qualifications. And the bodies who were responsible for regulating those exams, the qualification regulators, were directed by the governments to, instead of supervising exams, they were directed to calculate grades. And the idea here was that you could use available information and award a grade based on your best estimate of what that student would have got had they sat an exam. That was the basic idea. And the approach taken to this task was to award grades based on teacher assessments and other evidence, and then to standardize them. And this is a massive simplification, but I think this is probably enough to set out the approach, was to take some input information and run it through some models, and the models became known as the algorithm. Although, just as an aside, in our report on this, we avoided the word algorithm, and I can explain why we avoided that word in Q&A perhaps. The input information, two types of input information: the prior attainment at the school, in other words, the school's track record. So a school where students would tend to get several A's or all A's, that would be indicating one type of prior attainment. A school where people tend to get lower grades would be indicating another kind of prior attainment. So you take that, and you also ask the teachers to rank the pupils within the subject, within the centre, within the school. So let's say you're talking about a French A-level class of 30 students. You'd ask the teachers to rank them: best student number 1, second best number 2, all the way down to the least good student who'd get a number 30. Then the model took those 2 bits of input information and used the first, the prior attainment, to define the distribution of grades that school would be expected to get. So the high-performing school would expect to get predominantly A's, and the lower-performing school with the less good track record, fewer number of A's. And then to take that pot, so to speak, that pot of grades, and to allocate the pot out to the students based on the teacher ranking. And as we put here, allocate grades to individual candidates within those distribution constraints. That's basically the approach. There were lots of subtleties, but I think that's got the essence of it. That's what's important to understand. So that was done, and results were announced. And almost immediately, the announcements were announced. Algorithm became a dirty word. The Prime Minister talked about a mutant algorithm, and we have headlines like dreams ruined by an algorithm, or futures sacrificed for the sake of statistics. And you had these excellent images of students doing homemade placards which capture their sense of unfairness that they experienced. So just reading them, I'm not sure if you can read them on the way this is presented, but one says, "Teachers really know, computer grades must go." Another, nice and simple and succinct, "Students, not statistics." And then what I think should be the meme from this experience, in the middle there, "Your algorithm doesn't know me." Now, because it's our job to support public confidence in statistics, we looked at this and thought, well, something's going on here. People are marching in the streets against statistics. We've probably got a job to do to work out why that's happening, and to come up with some analysis, but also some recommendations. And that's what we did. And we produced a review, and we published that in March. And I'm just going to go through the highlights, the key points. The first key point, which I think is often lost on an English audience, is that this was a UK-wide experience. It wasn't just Ofqual setting A levels for students in England. There are in fact 4 different approaches. Ofqual for England, the Scottish Curriculum Authority, SQA, for Scotland, Qualifications Wales for Wales, and the Curriculum and Evaluation Authority for Northern Ireland. And whilst there were similarities between those 4 examples, and they all, broadly speaking, did what I described a couple of slides previously, nevertheless, they were 4 different approaches, some important differences, and they all ran into the same failure. And they were in all 4 cases, the models were ditched in favour of teacher predicted grades. So the same outcome, but across 4 different examples. And that's, of course, quite important because it allows us to compare and contrast things which were done differently. And you get a little bit of a natural experiment going on. That's the first important point. It was a UK-wide experience. The second important point is that this was an enormously difficult task. And the people who did it in those 4 regulators used a great deal of good judgment, incredibly hard work, and a lot of great care to come up with what they came up with. And I think it's important to say that, because they have been vilified in the media, I think somewhat unfairly. So the significant challenges were, they were directed to maintain standards to avoid grade inflation. That immediately puts a significant challenge. They've got to produce a distribution of grades which was similar to prior years. Secondly, in any year, there's enormous variability in exam results. A student might turn up not feeling well on the day. Another student might excel on the day against all odds. A third student might find that the things that she's revised haven't come up, the wrong questions come up. There's a variability in a normal year, and that variability is encoded into the prior attainment. But of course, nobody knows before they take the exam whether they're going to be the unlucky one or the lucky one. The unlucky one has the bad day, or the lucky one has the good day. But of course, the model is building on prior year attainments, which has got that variability. And I think that's a tremendous source of people's feeling of injustice, that the results as awarded by the models reflected prior variability, but people felt that wasn't really reflecting their own effort. The third challenge was the models had to calculate a single grade, not a range. Now, normal practice with any kind of modeling like this, where you've got you know, a range of data, but you haven't got perfect data, would be to create a range and say that the most likely answer lies somewhere within this range, within some kind of confidence interval. They couldn't do that. They had to say a single A or B or C. That's a significant challenge, particularly because my fourth point here, there was actually very limited data on which to develop and test models. Most notably, I think this is a really important feature, which I think was rather lost in the flurry of argument. Nobody had really tested in a very comprehensive way the ranking process, the 1 to 30. Instead of predicting grades for students, you actually rank them and say, I think this student is the best, and this is the second best and the third best. There was no data really on which to form a view as to whether teachers were any good at doing that, whether they had reliable approaches to doing that, because it had not been done before. And I think that's a very, very significant data quality limitation. 2 final challenges. It wasn't possible to learn over multiple iterations. Normally, when you're doing a modeling approach like this, you would do it for a small training data set, then do it again and then again until you've got more confidence. And finally, of course, this was done with incredibly tight timescales. So this looks like a very difficult task. Probably not impossible, but certainly very, very difficult. But there were some things which were, I think, a very significant part of what went wrong, which were not just about a technical exercise in coding. And I think focusing too much on this phrase mutant algorithm masks where the problems really lie. When we looked at this, we could see pretty much that the models did what they were asked to do. Rather faithfully, they took the prior attainment and they took the teacher ranking and they produced grades. And I think describing a mutant algorithm describes something which was out of control and not doing what it was asked. I don't think that is the case. I think the problems lay elsewhere. They lay in that data quality point that I've already mentioned, teacher ranking. Second problem lay in transparency and communication. I said earlier that the regulators had acted with absolute integrity, and that's very much true about how they communicated. They did a lot of work, a huge amount of work to communicate what they were proposing to do. But there were 2 things that were a problem. One is they felt that they couldn't communicate the details of the modeling approach ahead of exam results day, because they felt that would run the risk of people knowing being able to intuit their exam results in advance. My view of that is, if any student could do that, you should give them a statistics A-level straight off the bat. because that would be quite an impressive feat. But they were worried about that, and I think it's a legitimate. The regulators were worried. I think it's a legitimate worry. So there's a lack of transparency about the mechanics of the model until exam results day. More importantly, I think the communication that was done gave the regulators a lot of assurance that people understood the overall process, the kind of factors I was talking about earlier, and that gave them assurance that people thought it was fair. But what they found very difficult to test and couldn't replicate was not how people thought in aggregate about a process, but how an individual might feel when they, metaphorically speaking, open their envelope and get their result, which has been a calculated grade, not an exam they've sat. And of course, that doesn't matter for the vast majority of students who got a grade they were expecting. It does matter for those who didn't get a grade they were expecting. And I think that inability to really test, replicate how people would respond when they got a disappointing grade and how they would feel about that disappointing grade not being the result of them sitting an exam, but the result of a model, I think was a really fatal flaw. I think a tremendously important lesson there for the use of algorithms, which is to not just think about the aggregate fairness, but think about how people react when they feel they've been they've lost out. Allied to that is this point about human in the loop. Any expert in machine learning and AI will say an important tool is to decide where you have the human in the loop. At what point do you have a human that reviews the operation of your model and has the right to step in where things that are surprising are coming through. And there was no real allowance for human in the loop in advance of awarding the exam grades. And when we think about that, we think particularly about the very significant outliers. A student, for example, who was predicted 3 A's, who was awarded by the model 3 E's. Well, we think that that type of outcome should have been subject to human review, and some kind of pre-award discretionary mechanism, I think, could have been worth exploring. There certainly was no human in the loop in the exercises done. Final point, and perhaps my most important one, is this was always going to be a model, an approach with limitations. We think that those limitations should have been much more honestly expressed in advance. Instead, we had much more of a rhetoric of this is the fairest way to do it. And I think that tended to sound overly confident. And I think a bit more description of limitations would have been really helpful. I've got here 2 quotes from our conclusion, which are around the challenge of public confidence. And I've quoted them in full because I think they're really important. The first is that there was a broader public skepticism about a heavily automated approach and how authoritative that could be. And the second was that the greatest challenge was that the government and the regulators wanted the grades to be regarded as comparable to grades awarded in normal years, but they were doing something novel, and that novel thing they were doing had limitations. And it seemed to us that they were wary of spelling out the limitations too strongly because they didn't want to undermine confidence. They wanted people to say these grades are the same as prior year grades, so let's act as though they are, not communicate the limitations, and then of course failure to communicate the limitations creates the very lack of confidence that you're looking to avoid. I think that was a very, very important weakness here. So that's the exam story. When we published our report, we had some people who got things right, and we had some people who liked what we said. One person who liked what we said is Carly Kind, who's the head of the Ada Lovelace Institute, which looks at AI and society. And she said this in her tweet: "I was really impressed by the socio-technical approach taken by this report." Now, I'd never really heard that phrase before, and I wasn't sure whether this was a good thing or a bad thing, but I asked a couple of people. They said, no, it's a good thing that that you're being described as having a socio-technical approach. And so I was very happy to take the compliment. And that might come up again later on in this bit of travel we're doing together. Just before I get to some wider reflections, very briefly, the pandemic, I think, is another story about the public and data. We've seen the importance of numbers, but also the dangers of number theatre, sort of theatrical big number, which is a very stock in trade of how politics uses data. Here we've got last April, the Secretary of State for Health saying, I'm now setting the goal of 100,000 tests per day by the end of this month. That is the goal, and I'm determined we'll get there. Very good, very, very worthy ambition. We looked at this, we looked at the daily statistics which were describing whether that 100,000 tests per day were being met, and we concluded that this was not very reliable. We said publicly on the 2nd of June that the aim seems to be to show the largest possible number of tests, even at the expense of understanding. And then we said it's not surprising that given their inadequacy, data on testing is so widely criticized and mistrusted. Here we are, in a sense, speaking out against a kind of a glib and overly simplistic use of numbers in public discourse. I'm just going to skip over that example. Have been positives as well. It's not just the vaccine rollout, which has been positive, it's also the data on the vaccine rollout. We've written to the producers of health statistics in England, Wales, Scotland and Northern Ireland, set out best practice. And I think now if you go to the coronavirus dashboard and to the relevant sites in the 4 countries, it's amazing how much data is available on the vaccine rollout in terms of geographical breakdowns and other kinds of breakdowns. Lots of positives there. So I've said a little bit about the pandemic, a little bit about that's your bloody GDP, and quite a lot about exams. I just want to take a step back and say what we take from this as a regulator of statistics. So the first thing we take from all of these stories, but most particularly the pandemic, is that we're really seeing how important data are to the public. This is a screenshot from the coronavirus dashboard. The last update I had from Public Health England is that this has had 30 million hits since the start of the pandemic. And I'm sure you will all know people who are looking at this for their area on a daily basis to see the figures like how many people are testing positive, how many deaths there have been, how full hospitals are. It's become something that has become really part of the currency of life. I even noticed a few weeks ago that the Sun newspaper was publishing a jabometer, a record of how many injections, how many vaccinations have been given. That strikes me as a society that is extremely keen on using data to understand what's going on. Coupled with that general interest, we're also seeing another feature of data abundance, which is extreme personalization. The fact that it's not simply that people are interested in data, data can be served up to us on devices quickly, incredibly accessible, and often tailored to our personal interests and needs. I think if you put those two things together, you have what we are calling a phenomenon of armchair epidemiologists. Not professional epidemiologists, but people who are highly interested, highly engaged with data, and really want to understand what's going on. And we think that the really important thing that government needs to do when it's using data is not to alienate or to behave as an elite in the face of these armchair epidemiologists, which is, I think, potentially a very significant proportion of the population, but instead to treat that armchair interest with a great deal of respect, to provide information openly, comprehensively, to avoid the number theatre, and to provide equal access to information. That's really what I think the pandemic has told us. I think what the exam story tells us is that people are deeply interested in data about them and how it affects them. And I think the bloody GDP story tells us that people are very quick to sniff out a kind of an elite use of information which feels exclusive and alienating. So where do I go with this? And this is the part of the peregrination that we're on that is my most tentative in this talk. I want to go back to that tweet that I highlighted, which was about a socio-technical approach, because I said that I didn't know what it was, but I was assured it was a good thing. But that kind of got me curious about it, and I started to read a little bit about it, and it struck me that, in a way, this is what is at the heart of the work that we do at the Office for Statistics Regulation. What I understand by a socio-technical approach, and apologies, I'm sure there are people in the audience who know this way better than I do, and I'm probably mangling this, but I understand by a socio-technical approach that we as a society or policymakers should not just focus on technical aspects. They shouldn't just build a beautiful algorithm or a beautiful model. They should think much more about how that model, how that algorithm interfaces with people. And I think that's very much the story of the exams. Secondly, though, we shouldn't be pseudo-technical. We shouldn't parade numbers around in a pseudo-scientific way, because that's not really treating the public with the public of armchair epidemiologists with the respect they deserve. And thirdly, don't take a purely sociological approach. In other words, in socio-technical, the technical bit is important. The purely sociological approach would be to say all numbers are social constructs and have no kind of independent, verifiable meaning. And I would say that's to go too far. And what I like about the socio-technical approach is that it blends the technical and the social, as the name implies. It puts technical questions in a broader context of public dialogue. And I think that, in a way, is the issue of our age. I think working out how to do that in policy, in healthcare, indeed in how we think about misinformation, how we think about our interface with the online world, I think being socio-technical is absolutely fundamental. Indeed, I've come to realize that this code of practice that I said was our foundational document is itself socio-technical. The technical bit is in the quality pillar. That's all about confidence intervals and data sources and quality assurance of models, all the things that you'd expect a statistics regulator to care about. But trustworthiness and value are very much about the social embeddedness of statistics. Trustworthiness, their social embeddedness in an organizational context, people and organization that produce the statistics, and the value pillar, which is all about what the statistics mean to the wider society. So in a funny kind of way, I've been socio-technical for a long time without particularly even realizing it. So I think this socio-technical idea has got a lot of legs. It's brought to life to me some things that we were finding difficult. We are at a staging post in our migration across these issues, and that's maybe we won't end up using this phrase, but to me right now at this point in time in a world of data abundance, it seems really important and relevant. So I just want to conclude about your algorithm doesn't know me, conclude with three things. Firstly, we're in a world of armchair epidemiologists. The use of data to generate insight is increasingly valued. And I think in a way, we've always known that in our work. Ever since I've been doing this work as a statistics regulator, we've always wanted to advocate for this, to make data available to the public so the public can make its own mind up. I just think the pandemic has shown everybody how important it is. Secondly, this data abundance and this use of data leads me as a kind of new convert, the zeal of the new convert, to the idea of the socio-technical. I think perhaps we always were socio-technical and never knew it, and we've just had our eyes open by that wonderful tweet that I showed. earlier. And thirdly, I think public confidence in policy, in data, in models, in algorithms is so important. And I think identity and representation of identity matter a lot more than policymakers typically give attention to. My two really solid examples here, your GDP, your algorithm doesn't know me, they're really both about alienation of individuals, groups from an elite of decision makers. That's what the your in both of those examples tells me. And I think that policy, data, those worlds, think far too much about technical, far too little about these ideas of engagement and participation. So I'll close there. I don't really know all the answers. To be honest, I'm not entirely sure I fully understand the socio-technical approach. I'm sharing it with you because I'm interested in your reactions. I also think some of the things I've talked about here are quite easy to say. Understanding identity and public engagement, much harder to do. But I think I am sure of one thing, which is that if we don't engage with these questions around how the public think about data and they think about the models that are used that affect them, if we don't think a lot about that, this won't be the last time we'll have people marching in the streets under a banner which says, your algorithm doesn't know me. I'll stop there. Very happy to take questions. Thank you very much for listening.
Great, thank you very much indeed, Ed.
And shall I stop sharing my screen, Nick? Would that be the right thing?
Yeah, maybe that would be great. Thank you. Great. Well, thank you very much indeed, Ed. That was a fantastic talk, and there's a huge amount we can discuss in that, and I'll just make sure that we're opened up to questions. But I suppose I'd quite like to start with this point about armchair epidemiologists, if I may, Ed, because I think it's, as you say, it's very true that lots of people use and inspect and digest and talk about the data that's being produced, particularly on the website you showed, on the daily summary website on coronavirus cases and testing, vaccinations, and so on. But it is also true that the use of that data is very, very heavily contested. And so there will be people who look at the government data and argue, well, actually, this points towards releasing lockdowns and going back to normal very quickly, and the kind of lockdown skeptic position, if you like. And there'll be other, particularly some scientists involved in independent stage, and others saying, the data is much more concerning and we need to interpret it in these ways, and so on and so forth. And that has, as you say, clearly that's generated a lot, particularly on social media, lots of interactions between people, lots of, which in many ways is very democratic debate about these kinds of questions. But it's also meant that the kind of typical kind of methods of the presentation of data, that statistics are published, data is published, and its authority and expertise is unquestioned, and the conclusions drawn from it are, what the data tells you, doesn't exist like that. The data is interpreted, challenged, used in lots of fora, particularly social media, but not exclusively, leading to all sorts of different kinds of debates. And I wonder whether you might say something about that question, because your talk lent towards a kind of quite an optimistic interpretation of those things, of the sort of socio-technical leading to a more democratically informed and engaged public. But on another reading might be actually, we've seen some very dangerous use of data and statistics, lots of contest, lots of political polarization, fake news, even fake statistics, particularly around the pandemic. So on the balance of things, I wonder if you might kind of address that challenge.
It's a great question, because it reminds me, I wrote a blog with the title Armchair Epidemiologists probably last May, I think. I can't remember, May or June. And I thought, this is a great thing, you know, we should all be rejoicing and celebrating. And somebody who works in Public Health England tweeted words to the effect of, I've bloody had enough of these armchair epidemiologists. They don't know what they're talking about. They're always on my back. You know? And I hadn't, in a way, I hadn't really even thought of that sort of slightly jaundiced interpretation of the idea of the armchair epidemiologist. So it's a good question, because it pulls me up from my kind of dewy-eyed optimism and into something more real in a way. These things are contested. So I'd say a couple of things. The first is that I think it's good that there is a contest about these things, that we're not, you know, if our counterfactual is an environment of perfectly aligned debate and discussion where everybody agrees when the debate comes out, I'm not sure whether that's a very plausible counterfactual. I think a more likely counterfactual is where the government presentation of data is more closed, it's more limited, it's less open. And I think that the degree of contest and opposition, and if you will, fakeness that would spring up in that environment would be more extreme. I think an antidote to the risks of sort of interpretations of data running out of control is to make the data as available as possible, so the contest can be on an equal playing field, on a level playing field. So I really think that whilst it's messy and it's dirty, and you sometimes read things that you think that's not quite right, you also think that actually it's a healthy feature of this pandemic that it is possible for people to engage and debate. The second thing I'd say is, it's probably not right for me to name the newspaper, but I read an article in the newspaper last autumn which was heavily against the November lockdown. It was arguing that the November lockdown was not necessary, and that was kind of not a mainstream policy view. Now, it's not my job, in a sense, to defend mainstream policy. My job is to make sure data are available. And the point that I made when this was raised with me was that the use of evidence in that article was impeccable. It was really well thought through, really well argued. It was plausible. It wasn't the mainstream view of SAGE and of the government's advisors, but nor was it a crazy view. And to me, it seems that's a very healthy thing that we're enabling people to have a debate at that level. So I would say that, yes, my kind of armchair epidemiologist as a sort of sober, judicious kind of weighing up the evidence type is probably found us on some of the concrete examples in social media where it gets quite angry and it gets quite partisan. But I still think it's healthy that debate is out there based on data that are publicly available. And of course, it gets at its angriest when the data aren't available. That's the other thing you see, that people get most frustrated if they sense that data are not being made available. So yeah, it's messy, but I think it's probably less messy than any alternative.
Right, well, thank you. I've got a question here from my colleague Matt Dixon. Matt is an economist who works on education and labour market data, and Matt's saying, you know, the exam algorithms issue of being able to produce a distribution that gets things right in the aggregate, but not necessarily giving individual level fairness, as you discussed, echoes the, you know, your bloody GDP sentiment that averages mask variability, and we have to account for, in the case of GDP, you'd be worrying about people at the, you know, the bottom of the income distribution not benefiting from economic growth. And you know, in education, you know, you talked about the outliers, people predicting 3 A's getting 3 E's. Matt's question is, you know, it's difficult because it's easy to understand averages, but it's not easy to understand, you know, quartiles or deciles or points in the distribution. It becomes more difficult. And I suppose, you know, another example of that might be also the sort of use of logarithmic scales, which have been important to people understanding the sort of trends in cases and hospitalizations and so on in the COVID data. How do you approach that kind of challenge where you've got where you need a more developed understanding of the statistics?
So I think that that's a really good parallel, Matt, between the aggregate and individual fairness and your bloody GDP. I think the solution to the two is probably different, though, because I think that the solution to the aggregate versus individual fairness as a result of models is to think a lot more about the individual's interface with their individual data. In a sense, that's to do with the human in the loop and the quality assurance and the appeals processes and things like that, which I think are issues for any kind of algorithm. And I think that there's a sort of a toolkit there which works. I think the GDP one is really interesting and harder because it's quite clear that there are dangers in focusing on the GDP number or average earnings as headline measures, because they mask so much of what's happening in the distribution. And yet, no matter how nuanced the presentation of statistics is, that breaks down into deciles or talks about compositional effects, it just gets more and more complicated, and you'll end up with a media discourse which latches onto the headline number. So I think the answer is often lying in learning from some of the work that's being done on the communication of data in places like the Winton Centre in Cambridge, which emphasises doing as much as you can to put graphical presentations of data to capture as much of the story as you can. But the single number approach is what you do when you do it in words. You write it down in words. Graphically, you can capture a lot more. And David Spiegelhalter, who some of you know, has done a great deal of work on this, showing how you can actually capture really quite a lot of nuance. And people can and he's tested this with the public. People can grasp pictures which show, confidence bars and things like that, or fuzziness around central estimates much better than they can words. So I think probably the answer is that pictures tell better stories than words. I know that's a very incomplete answer because there'll always be the degree of granularity that you can't capture into a picture. But I think that's the way to go. I think that's the direction in which we should be thinking of going, because it's empirically tested. It's empirically tested work.
And perhaps then your regulatory role, Ed, would also encompass focusing on the kind of trustworthiness of data visualization. Yeah, absolutely
right.
Okay, another question from my colleague Iulia Corianu, who says that the success stories during the pandemic, such as the provision of vaccination stats, come from the push towards the timely provision of good quality data, but also from the provision of tools that enable people to interrogate and explore the data, such as the data dashboards and visualizations we've just been talking about. And Julia says, I think there's an appetite for more of these tools being made available to the general public. And the question is, to what extent is the need to make available not only data, but also open source tools from simple dashboards to more advanced statistical tools that can be used to analyze the data? How far is that currently part of the debate, or what we should be thinking about next?
I think it's definitely what we should be thinking about next, and trying to avoid that hideous word that I said I wouldn't use. I think the dashboards have been on a process of development, let me put it that way, since March last year. And you'll see that they've consistently learned and improved. In March last year, Public Health England and Public Health Scotland, Public Health Wales and so on, they didn't have data systems set up at all to do this kind of thing, and they had to build from scratch. Increasingly, they are making not just data available as sort of in simple spreadsheet formats, but in terms of the kinds of tools of interrogation, and it's part of the sort of development process to build those in. So I think it's really right to highlight this, and it's definitely on the agenda, and it's something that we would really encourage. So yeah, I think these tools are rather underestimated. If you look at the vaccine data now, I'm particularly thinking of the NHS England, actually, vaccine data. It is essentially a set of spreadsheets, incredibly detailed. Like, I'd be surprised if there's anywhere else in the world which publishes the level of detail that NHS England publish, but not as easy to kind of extract insight from as some of the others. And just to say, nice to hear from you, Julia. Julia works with my team on some of our research work, and it's a tremendous support of our work. So hi, Julia. Nice to hear from you.
Great. I should have said at the beginning that this event is being held in partnership with our Centre for Doctoral Training at the University of Bath. We have a Centre for Doctoral Training in Accountable, Responsible and Transparent Artificial Intelligence, which is very interdisciplinary, although it's led from colleagues in computer science. And one of those, the head of the centre is Eamon O'Neill, who has put a question in the chat here. You might be able to see it in the Q&A because Eamon's in our sort of panelists, if you like. But Eamon says, notwithstanding David Spielgarter's and others' work on data visualization, public confidence in these kinds of complex data, processes and outcomes can only ever be blind faith. The experts very, very often have no real understanding of them, so the non-expert public certainly cannot. He's given a couple of examples of that. Eamon, I'm not sure what the question here is, or are you saying that because of the complexity of both the data, the process and the outcomes, a certain amount of faith is simply needed in their veracity and in their authenticity and in their legitimacy? Is that what you're saying, Eamon? Oh, you've come on,
yeah. It was Ed's description of his role and his organization's role as to build and maintain public confidence in the data and the models and the outcomes. And I'm being slightly provocative, but I think it's a lost cause there. Other than to accept that some people will blindly believe it and others won't, because not even the experts can be expert enough to understand properly the complexity.
Well, I wonder if I think you're right, Eamon, should I pack up my bags and head off into the sunset? I don't think it's a lost cause in general. So, you know, the work that we do, I think, has really shown its public benefit during the pandemic. The number of times we've stepped in, for example, to encourage the publication of data that has been referred to but not made available publicly, exactly because of this armchair epidemiologist idea. And I think that when that's happened, and give a concrete example, really specific example, you remember when Leicester was being highlighted as a hotspot, and there was lots of debate about Leicester having higher rates of positivity than other parts of the country, and then therefore that needing to have certain kind of restrictions in Leicester. The data on which those decisions will be made were not available publicly to the people in Leicester or people anywhere else. And I wrote to Public Health England and said, you really should publish this. You know, people in Leicester probably have a right to know kind of what's being said about them, and they were. And I think that helped legitimize the restrictions that population were facing. So we've done a lot of good work, I think, and it has led to the public benefit of more data being available. I think your point is more specifically at the sort of the high end of the use of algorithms and learning networks, where, you know, the deep network approach, where, as you say, it's hard to sort of retrofit how the result has got to, because it's gone through a very complex layered network, which I certainly wouldn't understand. I think you're right. I think that degree of complexity, you get into sort of the limits of explainability, don't you? I mean, people talk about the need for the models to be explainable, but if the experts can't explain them, the public certainly couldn't. I think maybe that gets us into the Honora O'Neill world of trustworthiness. What Honora would say is, maybe it's a fruitless task to try and get people to understand beyond PhD level neural network modeling. But what we can do is furnish evidence of how the people who've designed and developed these models have what they have done to demonstrate that they are not acting in their own interest, that they are acting in a broader public interest. Maybe trustworthiness offers a route through there, that you might not be able to have confidence in the algorithm, but you might have grounds for confidence in the organization and the people who produce it. Perhaps that's a route that we could explore.
Absolutely. She makes the point of the difference between transparency and intelligibility, which other people have also made. There is no point in full disclosure if it's just a great big unintelligible heap of data.
Good.
Thank you.
I won't back up my bags just yet.
I think, I mean, that also takes us, Ed, into the kind of question of governance, of algorithmic governance, of moving from, if you like, regulation for trustworthiness or codes of practice towards thinking about embedding frameworks of governance in which we can have confidence and trust for particular services or particular areas of policy where there is algorithmic deployment and algorithmic judgment being made. But I want to just, sorry, if I'll move on from that point, because I have another final question from Angus Holford, which said, the algorithm assigned grades was eventually replaced by centre-assessed grades, which probably did not have neutral effects either, though far fewer felt disadvantaged. What's your assessment of how well these stand up to your code of practice?
Well, that's a question we've never been asked. That's a very good question. So you'll have to give me a second or two to work through that. So we applied the notions of trustworthiness, quality, and value to the models because it's our job to, in a sense, to defend the integrity of statistics, and that was what had been the subject of the public outcry. I suppose I'm struggling to apply our kind of framework into what is effectively just a process of educational assessment. Trustworthiness, I suppose you'd need to. So let me take the pillars of the code and work through them one by one. Trustworthiness, I'd want to know what are the sources of evidence that indicate that the teacher judgments are, so to speak, their best professional judgment and free from their own vested interest. And of course, then get into what are the ways in which we can be sure that teachers are not inflating grades for the purposes of their own assessments and performance and presentational reasons. There's of course good mitigations in place there, but I want to think about that in terms of trustworthiness. In terms of quality, I think that the question really to ask is the one that Angus has asked, which is around, well, can we compare these teacher assessed grades with prior year performance, the prior distribution? If we were to do so, we'd see, for example, very significant grade inflation. So I think there are tests we could apply of quality which might lead us to be, there are good questions to ask there. I think under value, I think it probably passes with much better flying colours. It was clear that this was something that the public and the students concerned were much more keen to endorse, the teacher assessed grades. Take all of that. I'm working my way to an answer. Definitive answer will be, I think all of that points to the things that now that we're in this year's approach, that I think that Ofqual and its equivalents are thinking about very hard how to put in place processes and governance that mitigate the professional risks, how to put in place a quality assurance, and how to ensure they retain that sort of public confidence. So I suppose I wouldn't give a definitive answer about how last year went against the code, but I do think the concepts of the code do apply into this teacher assessed grades approach too. There, how did I do, Angus?
We can see Angus will need to chip in back in the Q&A. It does obviously leave a question, doesn't it, Ed, about when we go back to external assessment and students sitting exams again, that there will be there will have been this change in the profile of grades over the period of the pandemic. And then the question will become, I suppose, public confidence in the people who are bearing those qualifications into later life. Were they seen as, having had their grades inflated in pandemic years? Or were they seen as, being given the fairest treatment possible, and, those grades are being used by, as they currently are, by universities and others to make choices about selecting candidates or appointing people to jobs and so on?
I've heard it said, maybe this is a thought for you as a university, I've heard it said that it's possibly a really good test of the quality of teaching in universities, because you've probably got UK-based students coming to the university who would not have come in a normal year because of the great inflation point, and therefore we'll be able to see whether universities are really good at educating people and giving them a good rounded education in a way that if you're just taking the top level students, which would be the normal year, you might not know. So I think it's quite an interesting sort of experimental year for the university sector, actually.
Yes, I think the social scientists and others watching would call it a natural experiment, and there will be definitely research to be done, I'm sure. And indeed, there is actually already research being done precisely on these questions. Ed, I think we've probably entrusted too much on your time now, and coming to the end of the session. And thank you to everybody watching and participating for your questions. They've been really good questions to put to Ed. But most of all, Ed, I want to thank you for giving the talk this evening. It's been really fascinating and enlightening. And these are huge questions that you've kind of touched on and are going to be, as you said at the end of your talk, they're not ones that are going to kind of recede. These are now part of our life, public life and public debate in very profound ways. So it's great to have your perspective on them, and great actually also to hear you talk about socio-technical approaches and to reach into what are often thought of as other disciplines, science and technology studies and other ways of thinking about statistics, and which is precisely what we try to do in our teaching at Bath and in our doctoral centre, to bring different disciplines together. So thank you very much for that as well. I hope we can keep in touch, and I hope everybody who's watched this session this evening can also stay in touch with the IPR, the Centre for Accountable, Responsible and Transparent AI at the university, and keep tuning into our events, downloading the podcast, signing up for newsletters, all those other things. But thanks for watching tonight. Thank you again, Ed, for your time. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much. Thank you, everybody. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.